again. I'm only going to talk for a little while before answering questions. In case any of you are familiar with the lingo, I am what's called an outsider artist. That means while I've taken a class here and there, I have no formal arts education background to draw on. I basically make these things you see before you more or less like some kind of mania, like some kind of obsession. You may notice a similarity in pose between some of them. That's not intentional, that's just sort of how I put together things. Now, I've been doing this for a long time. I know for a fact I was doing it when I was about 4 years old, because I would always get warned off stealing all of the twist ties out of the trash bags. Thank you. The poses are my attempt at showing what I feel to be a kind of balance, a kind of asymmetric symmetry that I go over. The pieces are made out of industrial wire, if you're wondering, and yes, I do have to go to great lengths to get some of them. Some of them, however, you can find in any craft store, and if you're interested, I could recommend some places you could begin. I think that I really make these for myself. If I was the last man living on Earth, if I was locked on a deserted island, I would still be making these. When I was younger, sometimes I would even take a finished piece that I was very happy with apart because I needed the stuff that it was made out of more than I needed the piece itself. They have appearances like I start with the piece in 3 dimensions, thinking of it like an object rather than a figure. The front and the back, they don't really have a front and a back. Some of the pieces that I do now, I sign with these brass tags. However, I would say they're equally appropriate either direction. I think that's about all I will say for right now. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
I have a really abstract piece of yours on the mantle in my living room, and I wonder, I haven't seen you do any just pure abstract ones in a while, and I just wondered what was the motivation for that.
Well, I like little people. I like pieces that have sort of a story, though I'm not too interested in telling that story myself. I feel like people connect to stuff more than they connect to things. I feel like people connect to figures more than they connect to abstracts. I certainly have abstract ideas in me, and some of the poses are pretty darn abstract, but I still like to think of them as little dudes. I like to think of them as action figures. I like to think of them as toys rather than just as art objects. Anyone else have a question? Yes?
Looking at these on the wall, and in the way the lights are hitting, I find the shadows to become an integral part of the piece. Mm-hmm. And I'm really enjoying that. When I've seen your work before in other shows, they haven't been lit with that kind of lighting. And I think these shadows add another dimension to what's really an interesting kind of piece to dialogue with.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The shadows are important. I mean, when I look at a piece, I look at it and think, how it projects, into the third dimension. I like overlapping shadows like you have with these lights, where you have like shadows from one light, shadows from the other light. I would be lying if I said that was intentional. But it's stuff that goes on in my mind sort of happenstancely, or not happenstancely, it's stuff that goes on in my mind without my really thinking about it. I think that if you make an object in the third dimension, you have to think about its shadow. And if you have a complicated enough system of lights, you're going to get multiple shadows. You can fight that and put the lights in such a way that they cancel out the shadow, or you can go with it. That's something that I've had trouble with in the past, was photographing my pieces where the shadows didn't overpower them. However, now I think I've gotten to the point where I know enough about lighting that I can have shadows when I don't want shadows, and have shadows when I do want shadows. So that's that. Any other questions? Yes, in the back.
James, if I take a right turn on Kings Highway or around Highway somewhere, I'm likely to see one of these characters on the telephone pole. And I know they're all over town, but can you talk a little bit about how many you think are out there in the public space, and how the police and the different vandals and artists?
Well, putting something up on a telephone pole is in its own way an act of vandalism. Now, I've never gotten a ticket for doing it. I have been handcuffed in the back seat of the cruiser on one occasion, putting up sculptures downtown. I have had some officers say, have you thought about contacting a gallery? Have you thought about maybe you could put your stuff up somewhere where people really want it? But I've always been able to just play the crazy artist card and get out of it. It started with Karma. If any of you remember Shreveport's really north Louisiana's only coffee shop in the 90s. I was making sculpture back then, but I thought of it more like a toy, more like a child's thing. And I left them out at Karma Cup for people to find, but didn't say anything about who it was. And I sort of had a reputation for being like quiet and broody, and I'm surprised no one put two and two together. But for about 3 months, they had like the drama of who was the Karma Cup wireman, and they kept finding more and more. And eventually, one of the owners of the place just asked me, and I said, "Yeah, that was me. I was putting those up. What do you think?" He really loved it. And even actually, people who weren't regulars at the coffee shop would come by and ask to see the stuff. And one woman with a jewelry business wanted to borrow one to hang earrings on. And I would have said hell no had I been there at the time. But one of the owners was and said sure, and she never returned it to this day. And John Perkins just reminded me of this in one of the texts coming out because of this show. So maybe I'm going to have to like track this woman down and give her a call. But the putting up pieces in public, I feel like if you go to an art gallery, you expect to see art. You'd be more surprised not seeing art, and you'd be more surprised seeing art in a non-gallery setting than you would be going to a gallery and not seeing art. I feel like putting up my pieces around town is a way of like paying back the debt I owe the city. All those years as an angsty teenager driving around late at night, all those years picking up interesting stuff off the side of the road and turning it into a sculpture or just putting it in a jar. All those things I've done in this city, the idea of putting up artwork around it really appeals to me. I've done that same thing other places. I did some in Europe, I've done a little in England, I've done it in every state of the Union I've ever visited. Even when I made a short detour into Vermont for only about 15 minutes, I insisted that we stop, and I put some up at a roadside cafe. But the idea of putting up public art with me is not necessarily approved artwork because I couldn't get approval for the kind of art that I make. It's guerrilla artwork, and that's something that I've always done and probably will continue to do. Any other questions?
I was curious about the inspiration behind a lot of your pieces. I'm a fan of ancient aliens, and I'm interested in indigenous cultures going way back and trying to depict what they might have seen come down. But the images that I see in your art are very similar to what's on ancient cave art and in indigenous people's art, which they're trying to, according to ancient alien theorists, they're trying to depict what they've seen come down from the sky. And they also have depictions of humanoid figures with animalistic heads and all. So I was curious, are your inspirations somehow maybe inspired by things like that?
Well, my mind is a big mishmash of all these things. I'm familiar with ancient alien theory, and I think that's a very interesting connection to draw. If you want to be completely literal, this piece here has aspects of Celtic metalwork. It has aspects of Aboriginal artwork from Australia. However, the figure itself is St. Joseph's with the Christ child. It is not my intention to give anything alien. However, you certainly could see, the profiles and perspectives as being otherworldly. This piece here is St. Christopher. And I think it's a really interesting story that basically he fell from being a pagan Viking into wanting to be a Christian, and he decided that the story goes that he found this really raging river between a trade route and a town, and decided he would just hang out at the river and help people cross the river, and that would then pay his debt to Jesus. And one day he showed up at the river, and there was a little baby, and the baby said, because babies can talk sometimes, the talking baby said, "Carry me across the river." And he said, "Well, this is, fantasy times in the past, so sure, whatever." So he carried the baby, and the further he got in the river, the heavier and the heavier and the heavier the baby got. And eventually he got to the other side of the river, and the baby was like it was 10 tons of lead on his back. And he barely makes it to the shore. And then he turns to the baby and says, "Fine, I got you across the river," and the baby is gone. And he thinks and thinks, and he realizes that that was the Christ child. And that the burden of his is to go out into the world and spread the things he believes. And he eventually, of course, he's a saint, so he got killed by a pagan king. But rather than sit in that safe place by the river, he decided he should carry the word out into the world. And that's what the significance of this piece. And this piece here, this piece could be an alien. I mean, it's got all the profiles, it's got, the bits and pieces. I like the swooping arcs. I like the fact that it has a definite front and back, but at the same time, you could also look at it, this is the beak and this is the back of the head. I don't know. I know I'm more inspired by mythology than I am with science fiction. But, there's cross-pollination between there. So I don't know, but that's a very interesting question. Thank you for bringing it up. You in the back?
Yes. Could you tell us, which piece is your oldest and which piece is your newest that you have here today?
Well, that's hard to say for sure, because I can't say a piece is done until it's in the hands of a collector or it's mounted high up on a telephone pole and I never want to climb up that high to get it again. This piece here was originally ungendered. I made it was much smaller, this leg was not this long, the arms were more like tight over the head. The trailer hitch, which this is a trailer hitch if you're wondering. The trailer hitch was like mounted up like a neck. But I went back and reworked it. I added some more of this thick, this like pencil thick wire, which is fencing wire. I added some more, and then you can't say, I think maybe like, this is the oldest, this is the second oldest, these two are about from the same time, and, when is something done? When is something done if it's not destroyed? You can say a car is done when it rolls off the assembly line. You can say the car is done when it's smashed into a telephone pole and it's going to be melted down and turned into scrap. So I don't know, but thank you. It was a very interesting question to ask. Anyone else? Yes?
How do the properties of the material affect how you work and what you're working on?
Well, let's take for this one. The thick wire here shows up rusty. It is the wire that's used to tie up bundles of rebar. Those are the long bars that go into reinforced concrete. And they come in, say, bundles of 12 or bundles of 48, and they have the wire on them. And that wire actually comes pre-wrapped, because it was wrapped and sort of tied in a knot. I like some of the wire. These are essentially the same materials. There's less of the thick wire in this one. But this one has been left outside and allowed to rust and allowed to age. And this one is essentially like fresh out of the box. And I don't know that I have like the same message with all of them, because this one, last I saw it before I brought it to critical mass at the Arts Council, it was sitting in the yard covered in leaves. So it was covered in rust, even some of the galvanized wires started to rust, and I had done that on purpose. And I hung it in that show at critical mass and thought nothing more of it. But then when I was getting it ready for this show, I thought, it needs a little color, it needs a little spice, it needs to not be, a mass of rusty jutting metal. So I went back and I painted it. And I think this piece is probably going to go up on my family farm in South Louisiana if we can figure out what to attach it to. But it's not finished. The paint will eventually peel from the sun. Some of the bits that are rusty are probably too rusty for the paint to protect them, so they will rust again. I like the idea of my piece existing as part of the built environment, not separate from it. I don't like the idea of my piece in a drawer in the permanent collection of the museum, wrapped in acid-free paper, in a hermetically sealed environment, or in like a glass case with a little humidity detector next to it. I like the idea of my stuff suffering and changing with time and the world. So that's how I feel about rust in my pieces. In the back.
When was the last time you had a tetanus shot?
I get it pretty regular. I get it pretty regular. Yes, yeah.
Did you bring something to work on when you're listening to the rest of the artists?
No, I'm just going to fidget with one of these.
Because you normally...
Well, no, actually, I did. Think of it.
Because normally you bring stuff somewhere as like stemming, as a way to, like self-soothing, right?
So I have a little bundle of wire, so don't feel bad if you're talking about your pieces. If you look down and see me making something, It's no statement as to your stuff not being interesting, much to the, otherwise, if your stuff wasn't interesting, I would just leave. But I just do this to sort of like keep my mind from grinding its gears. Yes?
My father is a very traditional person. All the years I've painted, he asked me, but when are you going to do a barn in the truck? When are you going to do another blue bunking shed? But when I was looking through an event I went to, he saw a picture of your artwork. And he's like, I want that. A man who never asked for anything just like that. And he's very much in connection with the material, with the wire, with the heft of it, because he worked with metal and machinery his whole life. But we ended up hanging it in a large window in his apartment so that he didn't want it, where anybody could jostle it or, mess up his metal work. But when we hung it in the window, we got the extra glow through shadows during the sunlight. And I love that your artwork has that kind of appeal.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes?
So when you're talking about that you like to allow the sculpture to change over time and it grows or decays or whatever, do you go back and document those different stages?
Oh, definitely.
Okay.
Definitely. And more than that, I want my artwork, like, there's a piece I did in Minden that's probably the largest freestanding piece I've ever done. It's about, what, Catherine?
10 or 12 feet tall.
12 feet tall, about 12 feet tall. And the story behind it is I was supposed to do a life-size figure out of welded steel and aluminum, and then a life-size mule. And they put together the money, they got people to donate money to buy all the supplies, and we had a connection with the salvage yard, and then 2008 happened, and the bottom fell out of the tech market, and everybody in the poor little community of Minden was like, we can't donate nothing, look at the price of everything is up, and this, that, and the other. So they were going to cancel the festival. And I can't remember how much we had negotiated. I think we had negotiated $8,000 for supplies, and I was going to cheat a little and buy a welding machine with the supply budget. And we were going to make it, and it was going to last forever. And the bottom fell out of the market, all the money disappeared, but Chris Broussard is a force of nature. And she scraped together enough money for $1,500 for supplies and $2,000 for my artist's fee. And I redesigned the pieces like one huge piece, but I couldn't find anyone who could sell me the aluminum wire cheap enough, so I did it in rope. I did a really thick welded armature, mostly T-posts that I bought from the metal salvage yard, and welded together this huge, really thick body, and then covered it in nylon rope. Well, that was fine for about 12 years, and then the rope was starting to decay and rot and just fall apart from the sun. So I decided I should do it again in nylon rope. And I did it in nylon rope, but this time, because the nylon rope is like a solid material and it's not a blend of stuff, I could paint it. And so now the idea is that every 2 to 3 years, they can refresh the paint, and theoretically the piece might last 20, 30 years without being redone.
So with that documentation of the work, do you see those stages
Yes.
as different pieces? Do you use that documentation as a separate thing, or is
A
that
little.
open form?
It's not. I see where you're getting there. But I mean, I like the piece with few exceptions, I like the way the piece is now. And I feel like the nature of the sculpture is the way it is now. I probably have photographs of, definitely this piece. This piece here, I think I have a photograph of it when it was new. I know I have a photograph of it after I cleaned all the leaves and stuff off. But I feel like maybe it's a different piece at each stage, rather than like one piece and it's unfinished, that each piece has its own thing. And if somebody had looked at it, with the leaves in the yard and said, oh, I want it just the way it is now, I guess I could have like lacquered the leaves and glued them on with super glue, or I could have like gotten yarn and rewrapped the places that had vines wrapped around it, wrapped it in yarn. But I don't feel like the decay is part of the piece. I feel like the decay is the piece.
Okay.
I feel like the piece itself is not a process of decay, but it would be like a picture of a stately manor in the 1800s, and you photograph it. Well, that's the stately manor. And then a picture of it in the 60s when it's decayed and burned out and has been lived in by vagrants, that's still a picture of the stately manor. And then a picture of it in the 90s when it's been turned into an arts collective is still the stately manor. But the process of it becoming the different thing is not the place. That's how I feel.
Okay.
Am I right?
There is no right for me. I was just curious.
Yeah.